She never measured a thing. Not the flour, not the milk, not the soup she poured straight from the can. A grandmother in the 1960s could stand at her counter and build a casserole the way a carpenter builds a shelf, by feel, by instinct, by doing it so many times her hands just knew. One casserole coming up at number 14 started in a Manhattan hotel dining room and ended up on Formica tables across the Midwest. And another at number 6 crossed into kitchens thousands of miles from where it was born, carried by military families who could not leave the taste behind. These were the meals that never had a recipe card because they never needed one. So hit subscribe and come along, because here are 25 forgotten casseroles 1960s housewives made without a recipe. Number 25. Deviled Egg Casserole. You hard-boiled the eggs, sliced them in half, and laid them cut side up in a buttered baking dish. Then you made a simple white sauce on the stove with butter, flour, and milk. Seasoned it with dry mustard and a dash of Worcestershire, and poured it over the eggs. Crushed saltines or buttered breadcrumbs went on top. It baked until the sauce bubbled around the edges and the crumbs turned golden brown. This was a Friday night casserole in houses where eggs were the cheapest protein you could buy, and a dozen of them stretched into a full supper for a family of 5. The mustard and the Worcestershire gave it just enough bite to keep it from tasting plain, and the yolks melted into the white sauce and thickened it from the inside. Number 24. Tater Tot Hot Dish. This one came straight out of Minnesota church suppers and spread across the upper Midwest faster than a prayer chain. You browned ground beef with diced onion in a skillet, stirred in a can of cream of mushroom soup and a cup of frozen mixed vegetables, then scraped the whole thing into a greased casserole dish. You stood frozen tater tots across the top in tight rows and slid it into the oven at 375 until the tots turned golden and the filling bubbled up through the gaps. Some women draped sliced American cheese over the top for the last few minutes so it melted down into a blanket. The beauty was the zero-skill assembly. You opened packages, arranged layers, and walked away. Kids loved it for the tater tots. The men loved it because it tasted like a hamburger with potatoes built in. The woman who made it loved it because dinner took 10 minutes of hands-on work and the dish washed itself clean. Church cookbooks across Minnesota and Wisconsin printed dozens of variations through the 1960s, each one a little different, none of them wrong. Before I go further, for the folks who want more of these old recipes all gathered in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It has more recipes like these, the ones your grandmother carried in her head and never wrote down. You will find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not push it again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 23. Asparagus Casserole. Canned asparagus spears, drained and laid flat in a baking dish, covered with a mixture of cream of mushroom soup and milk, then topped with shredded cheddar and crushed Ritz crackers. It baked until the cheese melted down through the crackers and the asparagus was hot all the way through. Fresh asparagus was seasonal and expensive, but the canned kind sat on the shelf year-round and cost almost nothing. Some women added sliced hard-boiled eggs between the layers for substance. This was the side dish that appeared at Easter dinners and ladies' luncheons, sitting next to the ham like it had always belonged there. Nobody would call canned asparagus elegant today, but covered in cheese and crackers and pulled from a hot oven, it earned its place on the table. Number 22. Hamburger Stroganoff Bake. Real beef stroganoff called for tenderloin and sour cream and careful timing. This was not that. This was ground beef browned with onions, mixed with egg noodles and a can of cream of mushroom soup, with a dollop of sour cream stirred in at the end. You poured it into a baking dish, maybe scattered some French fried onions on top, and put it in the oven just long enough to heat through and let the edges crisp. The sour cream kept the noodles from drying out. The mushroom soup did most of the seasoning. It was a weeknight answer to a dish that restaurants charged real money for, and nobody at the table knew the difference or cared. You could make it in the time it took Walter Cronkite to finish the evening news. Number 21. Green Bean Bake. Not the version on the back of the French fried onion can. The homemade one, the one your mother made before the printed recipe ever existed. She used canned green beans, drained and rinsed, a can of cream of mushroom soup, a splash of milk, and whatever she had on hand for the top. Sometimes it was crushed saltines. Sometimes it was breadcrumbs toasted in butter. The French fried onions came later, when Durkee started printing the recipe on the packaging. But the casserole itself predates the marketing. Women were stretching a can of green beans into a side dish long before anyone told them how. Thanksgiving claimed it eventually, but in the 1960s this showed up on regular weeknight tables alongside meatloaf or pork chops. A casserole was not just a meal, it was a system. One dish, one oven, 1 hour, and dinner was handled. The women who made them were not following trends. They were solving a problem that repeated itself every single evening. Mouths to feed, a budget that did not stretch, and a clock that never stopped. The casserole dish itself became the most important piece of equipment in the kitchen. A 9 by 13-inch Pyrex, sometimes handed down from a mother, sometimes a wedding gift still in its original box. That dish carried lasagnas and desserts and funeral potatoes and whatever else needed to go from oven to table without ceremony. It went to church suppers and came home empty. It sat in the refrigerator with foil crimped tight over the edges. Every woman had one. Most had 3. Number 20. King Ranch Chicken Casserole. This one came out of Texas and spread across the South like a brush fire. Torn corn tortillas layered with shredded chicken, a mixture of cream of mushroom and cream of chicken soup, canned tomatoes with green chiles, and a heavy layer of shredded cheddar. The tortillas soaked up the liquid and turned soft, almost like a savory bread pudding. Nobody agrees on where the name came from, whether it had any real connection to the King Ranch or just sounded like something grand. Either way, it became a potluck staple. You could assemble it the night before, keep it in the refrigerator, and slide it into the oven an hour before guests arrived. The chilies gave it just enough heat to keep it interesting without scaring anyone away. Number 19. Pork chop and rice bake. You laid 4 bone-in pork chops flat in a greased baking dish and scattered a cup of uncooked long-grain rice around them, sliced an onion into thick rings, and draped them right over the chops. Then you poured a can of beef consomme mixed with a can of water over everything, sealed it tight with foil, and let it bake at 350 for an hour and a half. The rice drank up the consomme and the pork drippings together, going soft and deeply savory without a single stir. The chops came out so tender they fell apart into the bed of rice below. Consomme was the quiet trick here. It gave the rice a richness that plain water or chicken broth never could. Some women tossed a sliced green pepper on top for color or shook garlic powder into the liquid before sealing the foil, but the plain version needed nothing added. 5 minutes of actual work before the oven handled the rest, and the kitchen smelled like Sunday dinner on a Tuesday. Number 18. Tamale Pie Casserole. A layer of seasoned ground beef with chili powder, cumin, and diced onion went into the bottom of the dish. Canned corn, sliced black olives, and a pour of enchilada sauce over the top. Then you spread cornbread batter across the surface and baked the whole thing at 375 until the cornbread puffed up golden and the filling bubbled underneath. The cornbread crust soaked up the spiced juices from below and turned into something between bread and pudding. This was Tex-Mex before anyone called it that. Military wives who had been stationed in the Southwest brought it back to bases in the Midwest and the East Coast, and from there it jumped into PTA cookbooks and church recipe boxes. Some versions used a bottom layer of cornbread too, making a double crust that held together like a pie when you sliced it. The woman who brought this to a covered dish supper never had to bring the recipe on a card because everyone already knew it by heart. Number 17. Macaroni and tomato bake. Elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, butter, sugar, salt, and sometimes a handful of shredded cheese on top. You boiled the macaroni, drained it, mixed it with the tomatoes, added a spoonful of sugar to cut the acid, and baked it in a buttered dish until the edges went crusty and the top turned a shade of red that no restaurant could replicate. This was depression food that survived into the 1960s because it cost almost nothing and tasted better than it had any right to. The sugar was the secret. It smoothed the sharp edge of the canned tomatoes and turned the whole dish into something that tasted almost sweet, almost savory, and entirely its own thing. Church cookbooks across the Ohio Valley printed some version of it, and every family swore theirs was the right one. Number 16. Ham and noodle casserole. Leftover ham was the starting point, and every housewife in the 1960s had leftover ham. You cubed it, tossed it with cooked egg noodles, stirred in a can of cream of celery soup thinned with a splash of milk, and folded in a handful of frozen peas. Poured it into a casserole dish, crushed a fistful of saltine crackers over the top with a pat of melted butter, and baked it at 350 until the cracker crust went crisp and the filling set. The cream of celery was the detail that separated this from every other ham casserole on the block. It had a lighter, almost herbal taste compared to the cream of mushroom that went into everything else. This was the dish that appeared on Monday night after a Sunday ham, and again on Wednesday if the ham held out. Nobody called it elegant, they called it handled. Number 15. Turkey divan. Broccoli spears laid flat across the bottom of a buttered dish, sliced leftover turkey fanned over the top, and a sauce made from cream of chicken soup, mayonnaise, a squeeze of lemon juice, and a sprinkle of curry powder poured over everything. You topped it with sharp cheddar and a scattering of breadcrumbs, then baked it until the cheese melted into the sauce and the breadcrumbs browned. The original came from a hotel restaurant in New York, but by the mid-1960s it belonged to every woman who had a Thanksgiving turkey carcass and 2 days of leftovers to deal with. The curry powder was barely there, just enough to give the sauce a warmth you could not name. Some women swapped the turkey for chicken and made it year-round. The broccoli held its color under the blanket of cheese and sauce, and the whole thing came out of the oven looking like something from a magazine even though it took 15 minutes to put together. The phrase "without a recipe" meant something different then. Today it sounds impressive, like a chef improvising with confidence. In the 1960s it was ordinary. Most women learned to cook by standing next to their mothers, watching the pour of flour stop when it looked right, watching the butter go in until the pan sounded right. Measurements were a pinch, a handful, enough to cover the bottom. You cooked until it smelled done. You baked until the top was the right color. Recipes existed, of course. Church cookbooks, newspaper clippings, the cards that came inside boxes of gelatin. But the everyday meals, the ones that showed up 300 nights a year, those lived in muscle memory. A woman could make a casserole with her eyes closed if she had to. She had made it that many times. Number 14. Chicken tetrazzini, named after the Italian opera singer Luisa Tetrazzini, who performed in San Francisco in the early 1900s. The original dish was invented either at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco or at the old Knickerbocker Hotel in New York, depending on who tells the story. Either way, it started as an elegant dish of spaghetti with chicken in a cream sauce, baked with Parmesan cheese on top. By the 1960s, it had been thoroughly domesticated. Housewives used canned cream of mushroom soup instead of a roux. Leftover chicken or turkey replaced the carefully poached breast. The spaghetti was whatever was in the cupboard. Canned mushrooms went in because fresh ones were expensive and hard to find in most grocery stores outside of cities. You mixed it all together, poured it into a casserole dish, grated some cheese on top, and baked it until the edges turned golden. The day after Thanksgiving, tetrazzini was the answer to the question of what to do with all that leftover turkey. You could stretch one carcass into 2 full casseroles and freeze one for later. Women traded their versions of it the way they traded gossip. A little sherry in the sauce was the mark of someone who considered herself a slightly more adventurous cook. Pimento added color. Slivered almonds on top meant company was coming. But the bones of the dish stayed the same: pasta, chicken, creamy sauce, oven. An opera singer's name on a weeknight supper that cost almost nothing to make. The original Luisa would not have recognized it, but she probably would have eaten a second helping. That is the highest compliment a casserole can earn. Named for a diva, perfected by women who never heard her sing. Number 13. Scalloped potatoes and ham. You sliced the potatoes thin, layered them in a buttered dish with chunks of leftover ham, poured a simple white sauce over the top, and baked it until the potatoes were soft all the way through and the top was browned. The white sauce was butter, flour, and milk whisked on the stove until it thickened. Some women used Velveeta instead of the white sauce, melting it down into a pourable cheese blanket that made the whole dish richer. This casserole showed up reliably the day after Easter, when the ham was carved down to the bone and there was still too much left. You could assemble it in the morning and slide it into the oven before supper. The ham flavored the potatoes from the inside, and every bite had that combination of salt and cream and starch that fills you up completely. Number 12. 7-layer casserole. The appeal was in the name, 7 layers. You did not mix anything. You stacked it. A layer of uncooked rice on the bottom, then a layer of canned corn, then ground beef crumbled raw over the top, then sliced onions, then sliced green pepper, then a can of tomatoes poured over everything, and finally a layer of bacon strips laid across the top. You covered it tight with foil and baked it for at least 90 minutes. The rice cooked in the liquid from the tomatoes and the meat. The bacon rendered on top and seasoned everything below it. When you pulled off the foil, the layers were still visible, stacked like a geological cross-section of a weeknight supper. Nobody stirred it. That would have ruined the whole point. Number 11. Dried beef casserole. Chipped beef from a jar, rinsed to cut the salt, torn into pieces, and stirred into a white sauce with butter, flour, and milk. You folded in cooked egg noodles, poured it into a baking dish, and topped it with buttered breadcrumbs. Some women added frozen peas or a handful of canned mushrooms. The dried beef gave the whole dish a salty, almost smoky backbone that no other meat could replicate. This was military food that came home with veterans and ended up on kitchen tables across the country. Creamed chipped beef on toast was the original, but the casserole version stretched it further and felt more like a proper sit-down supper. The noodles soaked up the sauce, and every bite had that distinctive tang of preserved beef that you either grew up loving or learned to love because there was nothing else on the table. Number 10. Broccoli rice casserole. Instant rice, a can of cream of chicken soup, a bag of frozen chopped broccoli, and a jar of Cheese Whiz. You mixed it together and baked it. That was the whole thing. Cheese Whiz was the secret weapon in this casserole, melting into a smooth, salty sauce that coated the rice and the broccoli evenly. Some women used Velveeta instead, cutting it into cubes that melted into pockets of cheese throughout the dish. It became a Thanksgiving and Christmas staple in the South, sitting right next to the sweet potato casserole and the green bean bake. 3 canned or processed ingredients and a bag of frozen vegetables, and you had a side dish that people genuinely asked for by name. It was not health food, nobody pretended it was, but it disappeared from the dish before anything else on the table. Number 9. Spaghetti pie casserole. Cooked spaghetti mixed with beaten eggs and Parmesan, pressed into a buttered pie plate to form a crust. You spread a layer of cottage cheese over that, then topped it with seasoned ground beef and tomato sauce and a blanket of mozzarella. Baked until the cheese browned and the spaghetti crust turned crispy at the edges. This was the recipe that turned leftover spaghetti into a completely different meal the next night. Women's magazines in the early 1960s printed versions of it every few months because readers kept writing in to ask for it again. The egg-bound spaghetti crust held together like a proper pastry shell, firm enough to slice into wedges. The cottage cheese layer stayed creamy in the middle and kept the meat sauce from making the crust soggy. It was 2 dinners in one, and the second one was better than the first. There is something worth saying about the women who carried these recipes in their heads. They did not see themselves as cooks in any professional sense. Cooking was not a passion or a hobby. It was a job that started again every afternoon around 4 o'clock, and the only reward was a clean plate and nobody complaining. They improvised constantly. Out of onions, use celery. Out of celery, skip it. The roast is too tough, braise it longer. The budget is short this week. Stretch the ground beef with oatmeal or breadcrumbs and hope nobody notices. They passed these improvisations on to their daughters the same way, not through recipe cards, but through proximity. You stood there, you watched, you helped, and one day you just knew. Number 8. Zucchini casserole. Sliced zucchini from the garden, layered with sautéed onion, canned tomatoes, and shredded cheese. Some women added breadcrumbs on top, others crumbled Ritz crackers. It baked until the zucchini was soft and the cheese had melted into every crevice between the slices. This casserole existed for one reason, and it had nothing to do with anyone craving zucchini. By August, every backyard garden in America produced more zucchini than any family could eat. You gave it to neighbors, you left it on doorsteps, and when you still had more, you made this casserole, sometimes 3 nights in a row, until the harvest finally slowed down. The tomatoes kept the zucchini from turning watery, and the cheese gave it enough richness to feel like a real meal instead of just vegetables wilting in a pan. Number 7. Poppy seed chicken casserole. Shredded cooked chicken in a mixture of cream of chicken soup and sour cream, spread in a baking dish and topped with crushed Ritz crackers mixed with melted butter and a generous shake of poppy seeds. The poppy seeds did not add much flavor. They added texture, a little crunch between your teeth, and they made the golden cracker crust look deliberate, like someone had put real thought into the presentation. This was a casserole that showed up at baby showers and women's luncheons across the South. It felt fancier than it was, which was the whole point. You could make it with canned chicken, and nobody would know the difference. It came out of the oven looking elegant and tasting rich and creamy, and the poppy seeds gave it a name that sounded more intentional than chicken and crackers ever could. Number 6. Chili relleno casserole. Whole green chilies from a can, laid flat in a baking dish, covered with shredded cheese, then a simple egg and milk batter poured over the top. It baked until the egg set and the cheese melted into the chilies and the whole kitchen smelled like New Mexico. This was the Southwestern answer to quiche, except nobody called it that. It came from New Mexico and Arizona kitchens and traveled outward through military wives and families who had been stationed in the Southwest and refused to give up the flavors when they moved back east or up to the plains. The canned green chilies were mild enough that even people who did not like spicy food could eat it without complaint. You could add a layer of ground beef or chorizo to make it a full meal. Without meat, it worked as a side dish or a brunch centerpiece. Number 5. Hot chicken salad casserole. This one surprised people because it started cold. You mixed chopped cooked chicken with diced celery, mayonnaise, a squeeze of lemon juice, salt, and slivered almonds. Spread it in a baking dish. Topped it with crushed potato chips and a layer of shredded sharp cheddar. Then you baked it until the mayo melted into the chicken, and the potato chips turned golden and the cheese sealed the whole thing shut. It came out of the oven looking like a casserole but tasting like chicken salad that had been transformed into something entirely different by heat. The mayonnaise broke down into fat and acid during baking, which kept the chicken moist in a way that cream of mushroom soup never could. Women served this at bridge club luncheons and afternoon garden parties, and the recipe passed hand to hand without ever being printed. The potato chip topping was the signature. Without it, the casserole was just warm chicken salad. With it, the crunch against the soft filling made every bite worth the strange looks from people who had never seen mayonnaise go into an oven. Number 4. Salmon wiggle. Canned salmon, a white sauce made from butter and flour and milk and frozen peas, mixed together and either poured over toast points or baked briefly in a casserole dish. The name wiggle came from the way the sauce jiggled on the plate when you carried it to the table. Canned salmon was cheaper than fresh fish and available everywhere, even in towns that were hundreds of miles from the nearest coast. The peas gave it color and sweetness. The white sauce held it all together. This was a Friday night casserole in Catholic households, where meat was off the table during Lent. It was plain, it was mild, and it filled you up without complaint. Most women learned it from their mothers, who learned it during the Depression, when canned fish and dried peas were among the cheapest proteins you could buy. Number 3. Cheese strata. Day-old bread torn into pieces, layered in a buttered baking dish with shredded cheddar, then a mixture of beaten eggs, milk, dry mustard, and a pinch of cayenne poured over the top. You assembled it the night before and let it sit in the refrigerator so the bread soaked up the custard. In the morning, it went straight into the oven cold. It puffed up golden and set firm enough to slice, halfway between a soufflé and a savory bread pudding. This was the brunch casserole before brunch existed as a concept. Women served it at church breakfasts and holiday mornings, and anytime they needed to feed a crowd, first thing without standing at the stove for an hour. The stale bread was not a compromise. It was the ingredient that made the whole thing work, because fresh bread would have dissolved into mush before the eggs even set. Number 2. Corn pudding casserole. Canned creamed corn, canned whole kernel corn, eggs, sugar, butter, and milk. Some women added a box of Jiffy corn muffin mix to give it structure. You stirred it together, poured it into a buttered baking dish, and baked it until the center was just set and the top was golden. It puffed up in the oven like a souffle and sank a little when it cooled. The texture sat somewhere between cornbread and custard, sweet and savory in the same bite. This was the casserole that nobody counted as a main dish, but everybody went back for seconds. It appeared at Thanksgiving tables across the South and the Midwest, and once it showed up, it never left the rotation. Some families served it as a side. Others put it at the center of the table and called it supper. Number 1. The everything casserole. No real name, no fixed recipe, just whatever was in the kitchen that needed to be used before it went bad. Leftover roast beef, half a bag of egg noodles, a can of soup, some cheese, vegetables from 2 nights ago. Everything went into the dish. Everything got covered and baked. This was the casserole that mattered most, because it was the one nobody would ever be able to recreate exactly. Every time a woman made it, it was different. The proportions shifted, the ingredients changed. The only constant was the method. Put it all in, bake it until it works, set the table, sit down. This was the meal that said you did not need a name for what you made. You did not need a recipe. You did not need permission. You opened the refrigerator, you looked at what you had, and you fed your family. That was enough. That was always enough. Cheese and potatoes are like a match made in heaven, and Grandma's cheesy, scalloped potatoes was straight out of any cheese lover's dream. So this casserole tastes even better than it looked, and let me tell you, it looked finger-licking delicious. The term scalloped comes from the French word escalope, which originally referred to thin slices of meat. However, in the case of scalloped potatoes, it refers to the thinly sliced potatoes used in the dish. Many grandmas used old-fashioned methods to make their cheesy scalloped potatoes, including hand-slicing the potatoes thinly, layering them with love, and cooking them slowly. Some even added secret ingredients they swear by, like a dash of nutmeg, a hint of garlic, or even a sprinkle of paprika for added flavor. The best part about this one was its crispy crust, and I'm sure you remember fighting all your siblings for the bigger chunk of it. This dish wasn't only tasty, but was also practical. It was a one-pot wonder, meaning it could be cooked and served in the same dish, making cleanup a breeze. I'm sure Grandma loved that. Bologna and noodle bake might sound a little strange today, but back in leaner times, it was a beloved dinner that kept families fed without breaking the bank. You would slice up bologna, yes, the lunch meat, layer it with cooked noodles, canned soup, and sometimes a handful of shredded cheese if you had it, and bake it all together. It was the ultimate pantry meal when money was tight and creativity was the only thing filling the fridge. You would spot recipes like this in old community cookbooks or handwritten on recipe cards stained from years of use. The casserole made use of leftovers, stretched meat farther, and turned everyday odds and ends into something warm, filling, and familiar. Sure, it was not fancy, but for a lot of families, it was exactly what dinner needed to be: cheap, easy, and satisfying. Over the years, bologna and noodle casseroles quietly vanished from most tables, replaced by frozen meals and takeout menus. Before there were freezers, before there were pressure canners, there were shucky beans, green beans strung on thread with a needle and hung from porch rafters until they dried into something that looked like shriveled leather and smelled like the memory of summer. The Cherokee are often credited with teaching settlers the practice, though German immigrants from the Palatinate brought a near-identical tradition called Get-Rocknet Bohnen, and somewhere in the mountains the two methods became one. To make the casserole, you soaked the dried beans overnight, then simmered them for hours with a chunk of fat back until they turned silky and rich. deeper than fresh green beans, almost tannic, tasting of smoke and thyme and the barn roof where they dried in August heat. A cornbread batter poured over the top and baked until golden turned it into a one-dish meal. What started as a way to survive winter became the dish families requested at every holiday. Leftover turkey in the fridge? Consider it your lucky day because that used to call for Grandma's legendary turkey noodle casserole. This casserole made mornings after Thanksgiving something to look forward to. This was the go-to recipe for using up leftover turkey and noodles after Thanksgiving or Christmas. All Grandma had to do was mix in the ingredients and add a topping made from breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even fried onions. Like most of the casseroles on this list, this was also a one-dish wonder and didn't require much labor. And you know Gram used to be tired from making us a grand feast the night before. So this was an easy way to serve something delicious on the dining table without putting in too much effort. This was a kid-friendly meal that appealed to even the pickiest eaters. What's not to love about a creamy sauce and some noodles all drenched in cheese? The beef and biscuit bake was the shortcut dinner that showed up on tables across America from the 1960s to the 1980s, especially when nobody had the energy for fancy cooking. You browned ground beef, simmered it with gravy or condensed soup, poured it into a baking dish, and topped it with canned biscuits that puffed up golden and flaky. It was cozy, filling, and stretched meat farther to make sure nobody went to bed hungry. You found this recipe in old fundraiser cookbooks or scribbled on recipe cards with grease stains. It was born out of practicality. Use whatever meat you had, pop open biscuits, and dinner was done. But like a lot of old-school casseroles, beef and biscuit bake slowly disappeared as complicated meals or trendy diets took over. Still, for the folks who remember scooping out fluffy biscuit and savory beef, it brings back the feeling of home when life outside felt uncertain. Hash brown funeral potatoes earned their name the hard way. They showed up after someone died. The recipe started in Mormon communities in Utah, where it was a fixture at post-funeral luncheons, but by the middle of the 1970s, it had spread through church basements and potluck tables across the rural South and Midwest. The whole thing was built from frozen shredded hash browns, sour cream, a can of cream of chicken soup, a heavy pour of shredded cheddar, and a topping of crushed cornflakes fried in melted butter until they crisped into something almost candy-like. What walked into the kitchen as a bag of frozen potatoes and a stack of canned goods walked out of the oven as something rich and golden and deeply comforting. The kind of dish that could make a grieving family sit down and eat when nothing else could. The cornflake crust was the secret. Without it, you just had cheesy potatoes. With it, you had the dish that said somebody cared enough to bring their best to your worst day. Next up, we have the shipwreck casserole. If you think this name's creative, keep watching, because some of these casserole names will leave you scratching your head. So, the shipwreck casserole was a go-to for families during tough economic times because it was simple, budget-friendly, and made with ingredients that were often already on hand. The name shipwreck referred to the hodgepodge of ingredients tossed together as if it were a shipwreck of a meal. Grandma's pantry was almost always stocked, but during the hard times, even she had to make do with whatever was available. This delicious casserole was versatile and typically consisted of ground beef, potatoes, onions, and canned tomatoes, with the occasional addition of baked beans or vegetables like carrots and green beans. Chicken and stuffing casserole was the no-fuss dinner that showed up in kitchens all across America when leftovers needed a second act. You would take cooked chicken, layer it with boxed stuffing mix, pour on some broth or cream soup, and bake until bubbly and golden. It was the perfect recipe for stretching leftovers after Sunday dinner, holidays, or whenever the fridge looked sparse. Old cookbooks were packed with versions of this casserole, promising an easy, hearty meal with ingredients you probably already had. It brought together savory stuffing, tender chicken, and creamy sauce into one warm, filling bake that fed the whole family. Some versions called for vegetables like peas or carrots tossed in, but most folks kept it plain and practical. Over the years, casseroles like this faded away as frozen meals and fast food took over weeknight dinners. but for anyone who remembers the smell of stuffing crisping in the oven and the simple comfort of a one-dish meal. Cabbage roll casserole was what happened when a woman loved the flavor of stuffed cabbage but had 4 kids to feed and no time to roll anything. The original stuffed cabbage came from Eastern European immigrants, Polish, Czech, Hungarian families who settled across Appalachia and the Ohio River Valley to work the mines and the mills. Their wives rolled seasoned meat and rice inside blanched cabbage leaves and simmered them in tomato sauce for hours. The casserole version took the same ingredients: ground beef, chopped cabbage, rice, condensed tomato soup, and a pour of beef broth, and layered them raw in a baking dish. It went into the oven for 90 minutes and came out tasting like somebody had been cooking all day. You never told company it only took 15 minutes to assemble. That was the unspoken rule of country casserole cooking. The less effort it looked like, the more it impressed, and nobody ever asked how you pulled it off. While the southern states were enjoying Tex-Mex cuisine, the northern states were all about Italian flavors, and baked ziti was a staple on the dinner table. Now, even with its Italian roots, you wouldn't typically find this one in Italy. This casserole was created by grandmas who were Italian immigrants to the States and adapted traditional pasta dishes to suit the ingredients available in their new country. Baked ziti was pretty much the long-lost cousin of lasagna, with the classic version including ziti pasta, marinara sauce, ricotta, and mozzarella cheese. The ziti pasta used in the dish was tubular and smooth, which makes it ideal for holding onto the sauce and cheese. This one was a hit at Sunday dinners and had everyone coming back for seconds. Pork chop rice bake was the hearty one-dish dinner that turned plain pork and pantry staples into something filling enough to satisfy the whole family. You would brown bone-in pork chops, layer them over seasoned rice, pour on broth, and bake until everything was tender and steamy. It was the kind of casserole that showed up when money was tight, but nobody wanted to skip dinner. You would find recipes for this tucked in old cookbooks, scrawled on recipe cards, or clipped from magazines promising easy meals for busy families. The pork chops flavored the rice as it cooked, making sure nothing went to waste. Some versions called for mushrooms, onions, or extra seasonings if you had them lying around, but most kept it simple and satisfying. Over the years, pork chop rice casseroles like this slipped off modern menus as people reached for quicker, trendier meals. But for those who remember pulling a bubbling dish out of the oven and scooping out savory rice under tender pork, it brings back the feeling of home-cooked meals that worked hard and fed everyone. The French also made a significant contribution to delicious casseroles with the easy shepherd's pie. It was a meaty casserole traditionally made with lamb meat. Shepherd's pie has its roots in British cuisine. The name shepherd's pie specifically refers to the use of lamb, while cottage pie is used when beef is the main ingredient. This one was an easy one to make as it didn't require hours of preparation. The dish became popular in the UK during the 19th century, particularly after the introduction of potatoes in the late 18th century. This one was used for meal prep, as it was great for making ahead and freezing. It was known as hachis parmentier in French cuisine, but different countries came up with their own version of the shepherd's pie. In Australia and New Zealand, it's often called cottage pie, and in some places the dish includes sweet potatoes or other unique toppings. She kept the canned salmon on the second shelf behind the pinto beans, and she only brought it down on Fridays. Salmon patty casserole was a Friday night staple in country homes where the pantry did more work than the icebox. The canned salmon, bones, skin, and all, got mashed with cracker crumbs, an egg, and a little grated onion, then pressed into a greased baking dish instead of shaped into patties. A can of cream of celery soup thinned with a splash of milk went over the top, and the whole thing baked until it bubbled and firmed up enough to slice. Some women laid sliced boiled eggs across the middle before pouring the soup over, a trick that made the casserole look planned instead of pulled together from what was on the shelf. The woman who taught you this is probably gone now. The canned salmon is still at the store, but nobody reaches for it the way she did, quick and sure, like she already knew what supper was before she opened the pantry door. You can't possibly reminisce about Grandma's forgotten casseroles without bringing up the ham and potato casserole. This one combined two classic comfort foods, ham and potatoes, and instantly became a favorite on the dining table. You know all those leftover ham that goes bad in your refrigerator after the holidays? Well, this recipe was a way to spice it up and turn it into something new, and of course, Grandma did it best. There was even a healthier version of the ham and potato casserole that was made using lean ham, low-fat dairy products, and extra vegetables to boost the nutritional content. Grandma used whatever potatoes she could find at the farmer's market, but this one could be made by a variety. Some recipes called for russets, while others used Yukon Gold or red potatoes, depending on your texture preference. Cheesy rice and sausage bake was one of those hearty, filling casseroles that carried families through the tough times of the 1970s, especially when every dollar counted. You would cook up some rice, brown slices of spicy sausage, mix it all with shredded cheese, and bake until it came out bubbling and golden. It was simple, practical, and came straight from those old, spiral-bound cookbooks or recipe cards passed between neighbors. The beauty of this casserole was how flexible it was. Swap the sausage for whatever meat you had, toss in extra vegetables if they were lying around, and dinner was done. It fed a crowd, filled the kitchen with that unmistakable cheesy aroma, and made sure nobody left the table hungry. Over the years, casseroles like this quietly disappeared as trends moved toward prepackaged meals or quick microwave dinners. But for anyone who remembers spooning out cheesy, steamy helpings of rice and sausage on cold weeknights, it was a reminder that sometimes the best meals came from simple ingredients and a little resourcefulness. Cornbread dressing casserole started the day before, always the day before, because the cornbread had to go stale. You baked a full skillet of buttermilk cornbread, crumbled it by hand into a bowl the size of a wash tub, and let it sit on the counter overnight with a towel draped across the top. The next morning came the sage, rubbed sage, never ground because ground sage turned bitter and only someone who had never made dressing would use it. The broth came from giblets and the neck simmered low with onion and celery until the kitchen smelled like Thanksgiving, even if it was just a Tuesday. Eggs bound it, and the whole thing went into a cast-iron skillet greased with bacon drippings. It baked until the top went crisp and dark while the center stayed soft and almost custard-like. Every family had their own version, and every family believed theirs was the only right one. When the woman who made it passed, Thanksgiving lost something the recipe card could never give back. Green bean casserole started out as a traditional Thanksgiving meal, but because of how much everyone loved it, it soon became a year-round delicacy. This one was also created as a creative way to market Campbell's cream of mushroom soup. When canned soups first hit the food aisle at grocery stores, many people were skeptical about them. Introducing new recipes was a way of encouraging people to add them to their daily meals, and Grandma really followed through with this one. The original recipe, known as the green bean bake, was developed by Dorcas Riley, a home economist at Campbell's. It combined green beans, cream of mushroom soup, and fried onions, and it was published in the company's recipe booklet. Our sweet old grandmas decided to make this one better by adding their own twists to the original recipe. Although traditionally rich and creamy, there were lighter versions of green bean casserole that used lower-fat ingredients or alternative toppings to make it healthier. Zucchini and cheese bake was the sneaky vegetable casserole that showed up everywhere during the 1970s garden boom, back when folks were growing zucchinis the size of baseball bats and scrambling for recipes to use them up. You would shred fresh zucchini, mix it with eggs, shredded cheese, and breadcrumbs, and bake until it turned into a golden, bubbly dish that somehow got even the pickiest eaters to eat their veggies. This casserole was a lifesaver during peak garden season when you could not give zucchini away fast enough. It popped up in community cookbooks, gardening magazines, and handwritten recipe cards swapped over backyard fences. Some folks added herbs or even ground beef to make it heartier, but most kept it simple and cheesy. Over the years, as backyard gardens shrank and prepackaged veggies took over, zucchini bakes like this quietly slipped off most dinner tables. But for the families who remember pulling this cheesy, veggie-packed casserole out of the oven, it brings back memories of homemade meals. Scalloped corn came together in a mixing bowl with the kind of ingredients that never needed a recipe card. Whole kernel corn drained and saved, cream-style corn from the can, eggs cracked in one-handed evaporated milk, and a sleeve of saltine crackers crushed by fist inside the bag. In parts of Ohio and the rural Midwest, Swiss cheese got folded in, a tradition that likely came from the Amish communities who sold their cheese at local markets for almost nothing. The casserole baked at 325 until it set like a custard in the center and turned golden at the edges. You tested it the same way you tested cornbread, a bump of the pan, watching to see if the middle still shook. Your grandmother made this for Thanksgiving and Christmas without fail, and the dish came to the table in the same ceramic baking pan every single year. She never wrote the recipe down because she never needed to. After she was gone, 3 different cousins tried to make it from memory. None of them got it right. So, tamales are a labor of love, but thanks to Grandma, this tamale pie was a much easier way to enjoy the flavors. This casserole caught on like fire in the early 20th century, particularly in the Southwest, where Mexican influence was strong. Just like most casseroles on the list, this one-dish wonder was also a creation of the Depression era. Some versions of this pie started out as a way to use up leftovers, such as bits of meat, vegetables, and even leftover chili. But hey, no one complained because the end result was a delicious dinner. Many families have an heirloom recipe for this casserole passed down from generation to generation. So if this casserole brings back memories from your childhood, it might be time to give Grandma a call. She could be holding on to a secret recipe that she's finally ready to pass down to you. Ham and potato scallop casserole was what you made the week after Easter, Thanksgiving, or any holiday that left you with leftover ham. You sliced potatoes thin as paper, layered them with salty ham, poured on creamy sauce, and baked until browned on top. It was the definition of a leftover makeover, simple, comforting, and guaranteed to stretch ham into a full meal. Old cookbooks were full of scalloped potato recipes, but adding ham made it a staple. Some folks dressed it up with onions or cheese, but most kept it simple. Over the years, scalloped potato casseroles quietly faded out as convenience foods took over and leftovers went to the freezer. But back when wasting food was never an option, this casserole kept families fed and brought warmth to the table long after the party ended. If cabbage rolls taught you how to stretch a meal, 7-layer casserole taught you how to stretch a prayer. The whole trick was that the rice went in raw, uncooked, straight from the box, and the liquid from the tomato sauce and the fat from the bacon on top cooked it in the baking dish. You layered it in order, and you did not skip a step. Rice on the bottom, then ground beef crumbled raw, then tomato sauce, then onion rings, then bell pepper rings, then celery, then strips of raw bacon draped across the top like a blanket. Covered tight with foil, it baked for 2 hours, and the whole house filled with a smell that brought the kids in from the yard without being called. The recipe showed up in community cookbooks all through the 1960s and 70s, always handwritten, always from someone named Dorothy or Mildred. It cost almost nothing. It fed almost everyone. Let's start the video with a classic, the Johnny Marzetti casserole. If you grew up in Ohio, I'm sure you've had this beef and macaroni casserole. Now, this casserole was named after a real person. Johnny Marzetti was named after the brother of Teresa Marzetti, an Italian immigrant who opened a restaurant in Columbus, Ohio in 1896. This dish was the restaurant's most popular offering and soon became the talk of the town. In the 1950s and 1960s, Johnny Marzetti was a common item on school lunch menus in the Midwest. That's because of its kid-friendly ingredients. The best part about this one was that it could be made in advance and baked just in time for dinner, which means you didn't have to visit Grandma for this one every time. The key to a good Johnny Marzetti was the cheese blend. It was typically made with a combination of cheddar, provolone, and Parmesan cheese. Tuna noodle casserole with crushed potato chips was one of those dinners nearly every family had in rotation between the 1950s and 1980s. It was not glamorous, but it got the job done. You boiled macaroni, stirred in canned tuna and cream of mushroom soup, maybe tossed in peas if you were feeling fancy, And then came the best part, the potato chip topping. A salty layer of crushed chips baked right on top turned this pantry meal into something comforting that stretched as far as it needed to. It was cheap, filling, and ready in 20 minutes. You found this recipe in every old community cookbook and scribbled on faded index cards. It made the rounds at school concerts, potlucks, and weeknight tables when money was tight. Over time, frozen dinners replaced it, but for anyone who remembers that creamy, crispy bite, tuna noodle casserole was pure comfort, a simple, resourceful meal that kept families fed. Yellow squash casserole showed up the moment the garden started producing faster than anyone could eat. You sliced it thin, no thicker than a nickel, because that was how the old women did it, and nobody argued with results. The squash went into a skillet with butter and sweet onion, cooked down just enough to lose its raw bite, but not so long it turned to mush. And knowing when to pull it off the heat was something you learned by standing at the stove, not from any book. The filling got folded with sour cream and cream of chicken soup, then buried under crushed Ritz crackers mixed with melted butter. That cracker crust came out golden and shattered when you pressed a spoon through it. Every church supper in the rural South had at least two on the table by the 1970s, and the women who brought them knew whose was better without anyone saying a word. Most people overcook the squash now or skip the crackers entirely, and what comes out of the oven is close, but never the same. Remember when Campbell's cream of mushroom soup and canned tuna were the stars of the food aisle back in the day? Well, Grandma took those humble ingredients and spun them into her classic tuna noodle casserole. During the 1950s and 1960s, convenience foods were all the rage, and tuna noodle casserole fit the bill perfectly. It was a post-World War II creation and was whipped up in no time with ingredients already on hand. Plus, it was a classic comfort food that brought everyone together at Graham's dinner table. During the mid-20th century, tuna noodle casserole was a mainstay in American cookbooks and cooking magazines. It was often featured in advertisements and was promoted as a quick and easy dish for the busy homemaker. This one fell out of flavor, but thanks to the recent revival of noodle dishes, we might see this one back on the menu soon. In the meantime, why not dust off Grandma's old cookbooks and bring it back yourself? Chicken divan with broccoli and cheese sauce was the casserole you made when company came over, but the grocery budget still had the final say. This dish showed up in kitchens from the 1950s to the 1980s. You took leftover chicken, layered it with broccoli, poured on creamy cheddar sauce, and baked it to perfection. Some versions added breadcrumbs or a splash of sherry if you were feeling fancy, but most kept it simple. You found chicken divan recipes in magazines or old church cookbooks, promising a fancy dinner with everyday ingredients. It was a proud, practical way to stretch leftovers and sneak in vegetables. Over time, casseroles like this disappeared as prepackaged meals and microwaves took over dinner duty. But for folks who remember scooping out cheesy chicken and broccoli, it brings back memories of neighbors gathered around the table and meals that still felt special. If you knew what a cushaw was, you were from the mountains, and that was all anyone needed to know about you. The cushaw squash was a massive, striped, green and white gourd that could grow to 30 pounds or more on a single vine running wild through the garden. Mark Sohn documented it as one of the signature vegetables of Appalachian home cooking, a food so tied to the region that most people outside the mountains had never seen one. You split it with a hatchet because no kitchen knife was big enough, scooped the seeds, and baked the flesh until it turned soft and sweet as pumpkin, but lighter, smoother on the tongue. The casserole version mashed it with brown sugar, butter, cinnamon, and a little vanilla, then baked it in a dish until the top caramelized and the edges darkened to amber. Old-timers saved the seeds every year, passing them to neighbors, keeping the strain alive. When the last person who saved those seeds stopped planting, something older than any recipe disappeared with them. So, squash might not be our top pick on a regular day, but Grandma's squash casserole was so irresistible that we found ourselves going back for seconds, or even thirds. This casserole was a staple in Southern cuisine and was Graham's favorite way of sneaking nutrients into our dinner. Squash is rich in vitamins A and C, potassium and fiber, making it a wholesome choice. Now, this dish was typically famous in the summer when squash was available in abundance, but you could freeze the veggie and enjoy it all year round too. Squash casserole was highly customizable, meaning Graham could tweak it by adding cooked bacon, sausage, or even fresh herbs. The secret ingredient that gave this bad boy its unique taste was a dash of hot sauce, so next time you attempt making this dish for a potluck, don't forget the key ingredient. Thank me later! Macaroni and tomato casserole was the Depression-era dinner that made a little pasta and canned tomatoes stretch farther than you would ever expect. You would boil up elbow macaroni, open a can of stewed tomatoes. Maybe crush them with your hands and mix it all together with a little salt, pepper, and butter if you could spare it. Some folks topped it with breadcrumbs or grated cheese when they were lucky, but most kept it plain and practical. This casserole was a staple in factory towns, farm kitchens, and anywhere folks were scraping by during hard times. You would find it scribbled in old cookbooks, passed by word of mouth, or jotted on recipe cards tucked in kitchen drawers. It was simple, filling, and did the job when grocery lists ran short and paychecks ran even shorter. Over time, macaroni and tomato casseroles like this faded out as newer, flashier meals took their place. In the weeks after deer season, the freezer was full and the kitchen adjusted accordingly. Ground venison and potato casserole was a hunter's wife's invention, a way to turn a freezer bag of dark, lean game meat into something the whole family would eat without complaint. The venison got browned in a cast-iron skillet with a generous pour of bacon grease because venison on its own was too lean and would dry out in the oven without borrowed fat. That was the trick nobody wrote down about cooking wild game. It needed the fat from something else to carry it. Sliced potatoes went in the bottom of the dish, then the browned venison, then cream of mushroom soup, then another layer of potatoes, and cheddar cheese melted across the top. In Appalachian communities from West Virginia to eastern Kentucky, this casserole showed up on weeknight tables all through the 1970s. It tasted like the woods and the wood stove and the pride of a family that fed itself from its own land. Speaking of veggie casseroles, the cabbage roll casserole was another hit on the dinner table. Don't we all love some good old-fashioned cabbage rolls? Well, this recipe took the labor-intensive meal and turned it into something simpler while retaining all the delicious flavors. Now this casserole has its origins in Eastern European cuisine, where cabbage rolls are a staple. It was a combination of recipes found in countries like Poland, Russia, and Hungary. Cabbage casserole not only tasted delicious, but also provided many health benefits with every bite. Cabbage is a nutritious vegetable that's rich in vitamins C and K, fiber, and antioxidants. Delicious and healthy. What's more to ask? Cornbread tamale pie was the casserole that turned Tex-Mex flavors into pure comfort food, especially in kitchens where every meal had to stretch. You would brown some ground beef, stir in tomatoes and spices, pour it into a baking dish, and top it with a thick layer of sweet cornbread batter. When it baked up golden and fluffy, the whole house would smell like pure magic. Recipes like this showed up in faded cookbooks, handwritten cards, and neighborhood potlucks from the 1940s to the 1980s. It was simple, filling, and gave plain ground beef a whole new life. Some folks added cheese or olives when they were feeling fancy, but most kept it basic and budget-friendly. Over time, tamale pie slipped off most dinner tables as ready-made meals took over and people forgot how satisfying a one-dish dinner could be. But for the families who remember scooping out steaming helpings of spicy beef and sweet cornbread, it brings back the feeling of gathering together and making the best out of what was on hand. The kitchens that grew cushaw in the garden often kept a crock of sauerkraut in the cellar, and what came out of that crock fed families through winters that started early and ended late. Kraut and Wiener casserole was German Appalachian cooking at its most practical, a dish built from two things that kept almost forever and cost next to nothing. The sauerkraut came from a stoneware crock where cabbage had been salted and pressed and left to ferment for weeks in the root cellar, and the wieners were the cheapest protein at the general store. You layered them in a baking dish with caraway seeds, a little brown sugar to cut the sourness, and sometimes sliced potatoes if the family was large and the wieners were few. It showed up in every holler and every coal camp kitchen from eastern Kentucky to southern West Virginia. It smelled sharp and sour, and it tasted like the kind of meal that got you through February. 25 casseroles. Not one of them came from a cookbook. Every single one came from a woman who stood at her counter and figured it out. If you remember any of these, or if your mother made one that did not make this list, leave it in the comments. Tell me the dish, tell me who made it, and tell me what you remember most. And if you have not already, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. I am James, and I will see you in the next video.